The Stillness Protocol. Story 1. The Stillness Watch. The problem with the night was never the dark, but the things the light revealed when it was not supposed to be there. It was late in the evening, around 11:15 on a Tuesday night in December, when the anomaly began at the Astoria Cannery, a towering structure of steel and brine overlooking the Columbia River. Lucas Hayes, the night watchman, was tracing his usual rounds, his boots echoing across the damp concrete floors, the air thick with the smell of wet metal and old fish oil. He was thinking about how much he preferred the simple, mechanical operation of the canning machinery to the complicated chaos of people. The lights didn't fail so much as they surrendered. In an instant, the standard industrial white fluorescent glare that normally flooded the massive processing room simply vanished, replaced by a deep, unsettling amber hue. It was uniform, pervasive, and utterly still, like staring through a piece of stained glass. It was not dim like a power save mode, but seemed to carry a strange weight, making shadows heavy and inert. Lucas noticed the change in sound before the light. The continuous, complex background noise of the cannery, the distant whir of cooling fans, the gurgle of the pumps, the groan of the structural beams, had flatlined. Everything was silent, save for a sound that arrived at the precise moment the lights shifted. It was a hum, a subsonic vibration that Lucas felt not in his ears, but in the center of his chest, a pressure like diving too deep in cold water. Lucas moved out of the cannery's rear door and onto the loading dock, which jutted out over the river. He checked his watch, confirming the time had stopped shortly after 11. The digital clock on his wrist was dark, and his analog watch wasn't moving. Across the street, lights were still on in the old Clatsop Hotel, but they, too, were the same strange amber. He grabbed the long-range thermal camera from his office, a heavy piece of equipment he was trained to use for fire checks. Looking down the long, empty stretch of the street, he saw movement. A group of people, 3 men and a woman, were slowly walking down Exchange Street toward the waterfront. They looked like regular residents who might have been out for a late walk. Lucas observed them closely through the thermal lens. Their body heat signatures were normal, but their movements were unnervingly synchronized, a slow, mechanical glide. They didn't appear to speak or look at anything. They walked past a parked county maintenance truck, its amber warning lights frozen and dark. He lowered the camera, rubbed his eyes, and picked it up again. The hum intensified, feeling now like a drumbeat deep within the earth. He watched the 4 figures reach the old dock area, an area known for having a few late-night fishermen and some local vagrants. One of the figures, the woman, paused near the edge of the pier. She stood there for what felt like an hour, absolutely motionless, before she simply turned and walked onto the pier itself, followed by the others. Lucas kept the camera fixed on the pier as the 4 figures reached the very end, where the wood was rotted and the rail was broken. He saw them stop. Then, one by one, with no hesitation, no splash, and no cry, they walked straight off the end of the pier and into the deep, black water of the river. The thermal signatures winked out instantly as if they had been erased. Lucas didn't move for the next few hours, staying fixed on the silent, amber street. He saw no more synchronized walkers, but he saw figures moving sporadically in the distance, their amber-bathed movements unsettlingly fluid. Just before dawn, when the clocks would have shown around 7 in the morning, the light and sound anomaly ended as abruptly as it began. The hum cut off with a sense of vacuum, and the fluorescent lights in the cannery immediately snapped back on with a painful, blinding white intensity. Everything was normal. His watch showed 7:03. He walked outside to the loading dock, his body trembling and his hypervigilance fully activated. He scanned the scene with his eyes, seeing the normal morning traffic beginning to stir. A city bus pulling away from a stop, a few hurried commuters heading toward the shops. Near the base of the pier, tucked between two rotting pilings, he saw something new. It was a blue flashlight, a heavy-duty model with a distinct, matte black casing and a white scratch near the lens, the kind used only by the county police department. It was a solid, physical piece of evidence that someone else had been here, someone official. Lucas picked it up, pocketed it, and decided the official story about the power failure was a lie. He knew what he saw. He would wait and see what the lie became. The sound of the river returned, the gentle slosh of the water against the pilings, but to Lucas, it sounded less like a river and more like a massive mouth closing. The night had taken its inventory, and Lucas knew his senses were now permanently calibrated to a frequency the world refused to acknowledge. Story 2. The Amber Aftermath. It was a terrible thing to be told that the loss which had ripped your world apart was nothing more than a blown fuse and a shaking floor. It was the morning after the supposed power outage, roughly 9 hours following the return of the normal, bright morning light at her home in Astoria, Oregon. Sarah Peterson stood in her daughter's room, a knot of cold dread tightening in her chest. Her 16-year-old daughter, Chloe, was gone, and the police were acting with a mechanical, dismissive politeness that was worse than anger. Sarah had woken up just before 7 to find the house's power restored and a single printed note taped to the refrigerator. It was Chloe's handwriting, though the looping script looked hurried and strained. The note simply said, "I had to go. I will explain." The police, led by a local sheriff, Don O'Rourke, who possessed a sharp, tired professionalism, insisted it was a simple runaway case, exacerbated by the fear of the blackout. Chloe was a good kid, but they noted the recent divorce and the move to Astoria. They had a file for her, categorized under voluntary missing persons. Sarah refused to accept this. The house was locked from the inside. Chloe's phone, wallet, and favorite jacket were all in her room. No windows were open. Driven by a desperation that overcame grief, Sarah became a relentless seeker. She started a private investigation, moving through the town that now seemed alien to her. She began her search in the quiet neighborhood near the waterfront, avoiding the official reports of a simple surge protection failure. She first went to the local diner, a small, greasy spot on the main street where she cornered the part-time waitress named Maddie, who worked the all-night shift. Maddie seemed distant, her eyes flat and tired. Sarah asked her about the strange amber light and the silence. The waitress simply repeated the official line she had heard on the news, claiming she had slept through the power failure in a back booth and that the noise was probably the refrigerator unit cycling back on. The collective amnesia of the town was total. A few days later, her search took her to the small, cluttered workshop of the retired science teacher, Dr. Aris, known locally as the Quiet Man for his eccentricity. Sarah had found his name on a local chat board, a man who had posted cryptically about the frequency of stillness before the post was taken down. She found Dr. Aris near his small, dilapidated house just a few blocks from her own. He was standing in his overgrown yard, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick. He did not ask her in. He did not deny the amber light or the hum. He described the hum not as a sonic event, but as a gap in the world's natural frequency, a silence that the human mind mistook for noise. When she asked about the disappearances, his eyes became distant. Dr. Aris conveyed that her daughter had not departed from a physical place, but had departed with a profound realization. He revealed that on the night of the stillness, he had been walking the streets near the cannery. He told her he had seen something, not a ship or an alien, but a realization that dawned on the faces of the people who vanished. He explained that a small number of people were suddenly granted a terrifying, fleeting moment of absolute clarity, realizing the world they knew was a comforting, low-grade illusion, and they chose to step out of it. He mentioned that the police, he claimed, had a photo, a very blurry one, of a blue light near the docks, but they had discarded it as lens flare. He was convinced it was a sign of a real, unacknowledged official presence there on the night. Dr. Eris's words shattered Sarah's hope of finding a human kidnapper or a rational explanation. Her pragmatic search for truth had led her not to a villain, but to a terrifying philosophical dead end. She went to the beach, the point closest to the hum's origin, where the waves broke in a steady, rhythmic pattern. She realized that the disappearance was simply the logical conclusion of her own deep, unacknowledged dissatisfaction with the world. She now saw the entire town of Astoria as a massive, elaborate holding pen. Her grief had been replaced by a slow, creeping suspicion that her daughter was the only one who had truly escaped. The greatest horror was not losing her daughter to the unknown, but realizing the daughter she lost had simply abandoned a reality Sarah was still too afraid to leave. Story 3. The Authoritative Lie. The first casualty of the truth is always the system built to contain it. Just over a month following the official categorization of the incident as a seismic-induced power grid failure at the Clatsop County Emergency Management Office in Astoria, Mark Jensen, the emergency management coordinator, was finalizing the supplemental report that would legally close the case. He sat in his sterile, windowless office, the hum of the air conditioning a painful reminder of the sound he was paid to deny. His experience of the event had been one of complete systemic failure. Mark was in the command center when the lights changed to the uniform amber. All electronic displays, including the seismic readings and the county-wide power grid status, froze on a static orange screen. The only information he received that night was a series of panicked, garbled radio reports from officers claiming they saw people moving without purpose and reports of an unbearable low-frequency sound. His highest priority had been the preservation of the system itself, the structure of authority. Sheriff Donna Rourke, whose composure was fraying after weeks of handling distraught families, had handed him the raw files on the handful of unresolved missing persons cases, including the missing teenager, Chloe Peterson. Mark had immediately flagged these disappearances as unrelated civilian attrition, but he knew the truth was a messy, dangerous thing. He passed a woman who was stacking files outside his door. The same waitress, Maddie, he'd read about in a suppressed incident report, now working temp admin for the county. Her eyes were still dull. She represented the entire town's desired placidity. Mark was focused on neutralizing the few remaining loose threads. First was the night watchman, Lucas Hayes. Rourke had brought Mark Lucas's rambling eyewitness testimony, a handwritten 5-page account detailing the 4 people who walked into the river and the discovery of the blue police issue flashlight at the waterfront. The flashlight was the real problem. It connected the unexplained civilian disappearances to a documented officer loss, a young deputy who had been dispatched near the waterfront and whose patrol car was found abandoned. Mark had already issued an internal directive to dismiss Lucas's testimony as a paranoid delusion fueled by PTSD, and he had the man scheduled for a mandatory psychological evaluation that would end with his institutionalization. He had personally edited the technical documents. The official report stated the seismic event registered at a low-level magnitude, roughly equivalent to a medium-sized quarry blast. But Mark knew the actual reading was something far stranger, a single, sustained, subsonic event that measured less like an earthquake and more like a perfectly flat, impossibly dense waveform. He described it in his report as a complex harmonic resonance, a meaningless phrase designed to sound scientific while conveying nothing. Mark's internal crisis was not the event itself, but the realization that the cover-up, the act of suppressing evidence and falsifying reports, was necessary for society to function. If the people of Astoria knew that their neighbors simply walked away, not because of abduction, but because a momentary glimpse of reality was enough to drive them out of their bodies, the system Mark protected would dissolve instantly. His job was to provide a reality that could be managed. He finished his supplemental report detailing the resources allocated to locate the remaining voluntary runaways. He stamped it with the final classification. Lucas Hayes would soon be contained. The Peterson girl's case was now a runaway file. The town had returned to its normal, functional rhythm. Mark sat back, looking at the finalized report, feeling a profound, terrifying peace. The true crisis was never the event, but the possibility of its acknowledgement. He had successfully buried the truth, not under tons of dirt, but under layers of credible, rationalized paperwork. The terrifying power of the lie was not that it concealed the truth, but that it created an entirely new, manageable, and officially sanctioned reality.